Welcome, everybody. I'm going to do my best Jay Sexton impression right now. Not actually. I look nothing like him. Don't sound like him either. No Britishisms. So welcome to the, I think, first official colloquium of the semester, because the first one got canceled, and so we did the panel instead. I want to introduce my good friend and comrade, Brooke Shannon. Brooke is assistant professor of political science at the University of Memphis. Oh, by the way, I'm Charles Zug. I teach here at the Kinder Institute and at the Truman School. Brooke works on public policy, state and local politics, and American political development. Before coming to the University of Memphis, Brooke was assistant professor of political science at the University of Pittsburgh. Like myself, she received her PhD in government from the University of Texas at Austin. Brooke has published work in eminent, fabulous journals like Urban Affairs Review, Political Research Quarterly, and the Journal of Political Institutions and Political Economy. And actually, just like an hour ago, Brooke kindly met with some graduate students from the MA program here and the Truman School to talk about her work and theirs very kindly. And so we are all excited to hear more about that project titled Progress for Whom? State Building and Progressive Era Reform, Evidence from Austin's Local Agenda. Let's give it up for Brooke.
Well, thank you so much for that warm welcome. And thanks so much to all the folks I met with earlier. It's really nice to have some, semi-familiar faces in the crowd. And I'm really thrilled to be here to present this work on the progressive era and local urban policy. And of course, thank you to my friend and comrade, Charles Zug. For the grad students here, it's proof positive that the people that you meet in grad school, those that are interested in the same things you are and who say cool things in class that you're interested in, like those relationships can really continue into your professional life. So hang on to your friends in grad school for sure. So this piece is part of a larger project, but today we're going to be talking about state building and progressive era reform using Austin City Council data from Austin, Texas. A quick roadmap of what we'll be talking about: setting up the problem or the question, what did progressive era reforms look like locally in Austin? Going to go through a little bit of the theoretical base, discuss the big project this comes from, the data building process, things like that, and then really discuss these results on local state building, the mechanisms that City Council built the city with. And then we'll conclude and have some questions, hopefully. So why Austin? Yes, I did go there and I lived there for 6 years, but that's not really what makes Austin interesting to me. When people ask, why, is Austin just a cool place to live and work and study? Yes, and kind of. If I was interested in the most interesting cities in Texas, I think Houston takes the cake for sure, because it's dynamic, labor unions, pluralism, Latinos, black folks, white folks working together. Austin is an interesting case because it was founded as a capital of the Texas Republic, right, of the Texian Republic in 1839. So it was chosen as this site of a new national capital, and then continued to be a border south capital city since, I think, 1845, I believe is when, yeah. I'm trying to remember the Six Flags lessons from the theme park. But so it's been a state capital since. Quintessential progressive era reform city. They eagerly adapted these policies that were floating around in the early 1900s. They were the first city of its size to adopt a city council or a city manager system, known now as council manager. Colloquially and in urban politics, you'll often hear council manager or weak mayor. So in a council manager system, the mayor acts at city council meetings almost as an additional city councilor. They have a weak executive role in that they don't hire and fire, right? They're not like at the top of the bureaucracy. That's the city manager. In a mayor-council system, that's more traditionally like Xeroxed from American national government, where there's a strong executive who controls the bureaucracy and like a legislative branch. That would be mayor-council. So that's why I really think Austin is an interesting case to study, because the city has changed. Some of y'all may have visited for like Austin City Limits or South by Southwest, or like one of the bazillion bachelor and bachelorette parties that take place there annually. But the government has nothing to do with that. They're really indicative of like a southern city government that doesn't like to change. And so that's what makes it an interesting case for me. This paper is part of a book project called The City Agenda. It will have a 125-year time series from 1900 through 2025 when it's completed, to compare across eras of development and see how local governments make policies to answer different problems in eras of urbanization, like instead of across geography, comparing across time. So let's get started with just a little bit of framework for what we're working with. Austin, like I said, was founded in 1839. It was established with a really common city government structure of the day, the ward aldermanic system. The only American like major city that still has this is Chicago. So is anybody from Chicago here? Kind of close, yeah, ish. So you're familiar with all of the aldermen politics maybe, the like 80 aldermen that represent. So wards are districts, but they're really small, compact. So it works for an old city that's like 12 square city blocks, and it works for a city that is really interested in keeping that super hyper local representation. This lasted until 1908 when Austin adopted the commission style government. This style of government still exists in some southern cities. I think Charleston, maybe Columbia, South Carolina still has it, but they're few and far between. And that's because in a commission-style government, every city councilor is also the head of a local bureaucracy or agency. So it's like city councilor 1 is head of streets, city councilor 2 is head of like sanitation, and basically the meetings are super bureaucratic. They meet and give their reports. This style system was invented in 1901 after the major hurricane in Galveston, Texas, that destroyed half of the buildings and killed like 20–30% of the people because they didn't have that's why we have modern meteorology in some ways, because they didn't know the hurricane was coming, and then they needed rapid response. Sounds a little familiar, right? Recently, rapid response, mutual aid. They had to come together to address like some very serious immediate problems, so that's why that worked out. And that's also why this has kind of fallen out of favor, because there's a lot more issues that need to get solved in the city. This system lasted until 1924, when Austin adopted an at-large system. At-large city councils mean that each city councilor is elected to serve the city as a whole, and the electorate is also the city as a whole. So there's no districts here. In a purely at-large system, it's like the top 4 or 5 or 6, however large the city government is, it ranges of course. The top 4 or so like vote getters get a seat. But there are several systems now that are like hybrid, some districts, some at large. There are also some systems that are still at large where the elections are kind of staggered. So if I wanted to run, I would run for like place or seat 1 through 4, something like that. But it's still, in a pure at-large system, it's multi-member election. And this system lasted in Austin remarkably long. So right, path dependent, trying not to change, for about 80–90 years, 1924 to 2012. This, we're gonna end the analysis in 1940 for this project, but I just wanted to show you how like deeply entrenched the structure is in Austin. By 1927, the city had also adopted nonpartisan and off-year elections. For a long time, elections took place in May of odd number years, so not on the same calendar as like Congress and the president. And this was done intentionally. It was part of the progressive era reformers' idea to make like the best people participate and serve in local government. So they wanted only participation from people who were like interested and invested enough to care to go down to City Hall and cast their vote in May of like 2015 instead of waiting for November 2016 to vote. So this is like a very common thing. 1927, the like final complete suite of progressive era policies had been passed in Austin. And then in 1928, they passed a city plan that they began in 1927. So this is kind of like the final step of a progressive era city. So we all feel like we are good on Austin, Austinites here? Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about where I'm coming from in this piece. My aim is not to just like discuss the long history of Austin for sure. I'm more interested in these institutional processes. The main question that I have here is the famous theory by Steve Skoranek on how bureaucracy was built in the progressive era nationally, and they were the main administrative state builders that took power from courts and political parties and tried to streamline how policy was done in Washington. I want to know how that worked and if it worked, if it happened at all, at the local level. So I'm bringing this to urban politics. Part of this progressive era reform movement was targeted at urban politics, like across the country though. Has anybody seen the really good TV show on HBO called Boardwalk Empire? So I always ask this question because it's such a good study on local politics from the 1920s and progressive era politics and how like women's participation really shaped the progressive movement. I'm not going to show you any clips from that show, but big recommend. So a lot of the reforms of this time were like concurrent with women's suffrage, with prohibition, things like that. And they're all about like corruption and how these kinds of moral questions show themselves in policymaking and government. So at the local level, we're thinking about institutions like Tammany Hall, where immigrants would land in New York and be handed filled-in ballots to turn in exchange for like beer and cheese when they arrive. In New York. We're thinking about Chicago, no offense, about like the long political machines that have run the city. So this is the kind of stuff that they said was bad. They also said this type of ward aldermanic system was really suited to immigrants and people of color and the poor because they're like really invested in patronage policies. They participate in government to get stuff from government. They don't have like the whole city in mind. So that was the big motivators for these urban reform movements and for the progressive movement at large and how they show up locally. Again, the big ones we're thinking about today are at-large reforms, at-large councils, and city managers, how they reform the city. Okay. Local government is constrained. It's the most constrained level of government because it's at the bottom. So anything the state and national level do, they kind of constrain and decide what the local level is able to do. State by state, home rule and like municipal government is outlined in state constitutions. So land use is one of the most effective ways local government make policy. And if you've ever seen a local government agenda, it's mostly like zoning ordinances, right, where you can build what, things like that. So big policy levers are zoning ordinances, city plans on the grander scale, and then policies of control, right, looking like redlining within these master plans, and this idea of like social, class, and racial order forming through land use policies. A lot of the progressive sort of reasoning behind this gets back to those ideas of anti-immigrant and anti-poor, anti-communities of color, because they say, listen, when poor people move in, they drive our property values down. There's a lot of vice down there. There's a lot of crime that happens down there, gambling halls, right? Drinking, stuff like that. So we need to like zone where that stuff can be so that we all can live and be happy in our like nice neighborhood. That's basically how this like land use, class, race policy area really comes together in the like 1920s. So all over the country at every level, the progressive movement and the Progressive Party and parties that were aligned with it really were excited about US imperialism and anti-immigrant policy. But the southern version of it was just a little bit more explicit about like white supremacy as its effective aim. I have some work with E.J. Fagan and Brian Jones about third parties during this time and how sort of across the board, regardless of whether they were the populists, even like the socialists and the anarchist parties back then, farmers' parties, like all of this was kind of baked in. This anti-immigrant, pro-nativist sentiment. Puerto Rico and the Philippine War was happening at the time, right? The US-Spanish War. So it was a lot of very explicit kind of pro-nativist, white supremacist language. At the local level, these master plans, these city plans, housing, zoning policies really contribute to that through housing, unequal public service provision for low-income and communities of color. So again, we're in Austin. We're looking at these different items on the city council agenda. The data set that we're working on today have about 30,000 items. Every item on the city council agenda, every time they met from 1900 through 1940. So that's 41 years out of the 125 total years. So how I did this was collect everything, scrape all the PDFs that were available online, thank goodness, and double-coded and reconciled these items. What that means is, according to the Policy Agendas Project codebook that was modified at the local government level, every item was given one policy subtopic code, so one of 225, that are nestled within 21 major topics. So those major topics are like economics, civil rights, health, food and agriculture, labor, education. It like spans the whole policy agenda. And within those are the subtopics of if it's health, it's healthcare reform, hospitals, personnel, right? We get a more fine-grained look at what they were talking about or what is on the agenda. So it was between me and a rotating slate of graduate students and undergrad researchers that helped me double code these, and where we disagreed, we talked about it and reconciled those codes. It was usually about 20 to 25% of the codes we needed to reconcile, and then I dumped the items that happen every meeting, like approving the minutes from last week. You have to do that every week. And then remove the items that are policy, like devoid of policy substance. So a lot of those are like, if I sign up to talk at a city council meeting and don't show up, that's of course devoid of policy. So I dumped all of those, and that's what we were left with, the 29,677 items in this data set. So visually, this is what the process kind of looks like. So the gray line is meetings, the black line is items, and there are different scales on the side. And just visually, what we see is some interesting historical moments. So meetings had like a chunky but upward spiral until about 1918, which makes some sense, because the city council was meeting maybe once a week those 2 or 3 years, 1918, 1919, and then 1920 was they were starting to build back. And basically, the only items on the agenda those years were counting the number of dead from the flu at home and from the war abroad in World War I. But I wanted to show you this because there's an interesting pattern that emerges. The meetings never really recover. They take this nosedive around 1918, and then they just continue to stay flat around like 55 meetings, which is about once a week per year. But the items continue to rise. Also not like a perfect line, right? But they continue to rise, which means that the city council is professionalizing. They're meeting about once a week, and they're doing way more stuff when they meet. Before, it looks more ad hoc, right? The city, again, is like 12 square blocks, and there's a group of 4 men who meet weekly. One of them, they elect from within to be the mayor, and they were kind of like the only game in town. They're the only policymakers, right? There was a very weird ad hoc bureaucracy that was sort of forming. But after this era, we see that city council is making more decisions in fewer meetings. So this is pretty curious. This is what the agenda looks like. So I wanted to show 4 examples once per decade of what this data set looks like, because I really like combing through these and feeling kind of like a historical detective, but also feeling like the meeting agenda itself is kind of an indicator of urbanization, professionalization, and development. So I know you can't read the top left, I weirdly can now after practicing a lot, ruining my eyes, like transcribing these. But essentially, using this document as a measure of development, they got a typewriter in 1910, so shout out to them. But 1903, this item is about grading streets or making sure that the dirt roads are paved enough or patted down enough for people to get carts on. 1913, let me see so I don't have to read them. 1913 is the general fund budget. It wasn't until 1927 that the budget was its own document outside of city council minutes. 1923, 2 police officers were nominated and appointed for service by the city council. Again, like before the bureaucracy was really established, city council had to do all of this work, and we'll talk about that in just a sec. And 1933 is burying telegraph lines in the city. So this is sort of an indicator of how Austin was like becoming a city at the time, right? From grading streets up to telegraph lines. Okay, so some hypotheses that we're looking for today. First, the policy agenda, I expect, becomes more focused or less diverse after the at-large council takes over. I expect nominations and appointments to decline following 1924 when the at-large council is established. And finally, I expect attention to land use to increase after the at-large reform in 1924 as well, because zoning was such an important policy tool for them. And then with the focus on race and racial politics, I expect attention to race and racial minorities to decrease after the 1928 city plan, but increase for those 3 years between the at-large council being elected in and the city plan being passed. So let's see. Okay, quickly, I want to talk about how I did this stuff. So Shannon's H, I am not the Shannon. Does anybody work with Shannon's H? Have y'all ever seen diversity indices? So Shannon's H was developed by like the earth sciences to study diversity in forests. So natural, like, natural stuff. There's another diversity index that we use called the Herfindahl index, the Hirschman-Herfindahl, that is used to study monopolization in the economy. And I use that as a validation check, but we're going to focus on Shannon's H real quick. We use it in policy studies to determine the same thing as the natural folks do, the natural sciences, basically to study entropy or homogeneity on the agenda. So a score of 1 means that there's like pure diversity, which means that city council, I collected these all per year. So every year, city council paid attention to each major topic, so all these 21 major topics in the same proportion across the year. A score of 0 would show that they only talk about 1 major topic all year. So this is just to see how diverse and how many items, how much the attention is split of city council over time. Then I analyzed some of the data using regression discontinuity design, and that's because I want to see how stuff changed before and after 1924 and 1928. I have the regression tables in the appendix. If you have any questions about it, we can check them out, but I just want to show like the figures, the plots now. So let's think about agenda diversity. So this is 1924. This is, of course, before and after. This is the diversity score, the Shannon's H score for the year of the whole agenda. So typically, diversity is between like 3 and 4 for a policy agenda. So we're kind of right on the money for most of this. And what this shows is a statistically significant difference. It's like a few points below after 1924. And what that shows is that city council was talking about fewer items or fewer major topics after they became an at-large council. Meaningfully, it probably wasn't like super obvious. I don't think the city council was talking about a whole host of things and then immediately stopped as soon as they became at-large. So it probably wasn't very tangible. And then we noticed some outliers here, like early 1930s, which was definitely a result of the national political system and the national economy that crashed for the Great Depression. So at this time, City Council was working on a few things, probably things like food and labor and like implementing the WPA and things like that. But this shows an effect of the at-large council and the progressive era government, but I would say it's not like a blockbuster finding, right? It shows that diversity went down, just not by much. And it was likely due to the reforms of the government system. But when we look at nominations and appointments, I think this figure is pretty interesting because what I wanted to see here is if this like development, this movement towards a progressive style government, building the local bureaucracy and the administrative state looks differently once the big progressive reform has taken place, which is the at-large council. And I find that it definitely does decrease after 1924. But the agenda of the city council definitely changed. They were nominating and appointing people less often because they didn't have to, because they had hired a city manager who dealt with all of this stuff. Now, before we move on, I want to talk a little bit about what nominations and appointments look like at the local level. Before 1924 especially, again, city council, the foremen in City Hall, were the only people making policy for the city of Austin at the time. So anytime any person working for the city needed like a day off or a leave of absence or to resign, they had to get that approved at the city council meeting. So it doesn't take up like the lion's share of the agenda, certainly, but it was consistently on the agenda weekly where somebody would come and resign, take a leave of absence, et cetera, et cetera. But more importantly, they were staffing the local government. So the main two departments at the time that were nominated and appointed were, as we saw in the early 1900s, the Public Safety Department, which included police and fire. This was like a major part of building the administrative state locally. But there was another department that was sanitation and streets. And these two policy areas are in different major topics in terms of like the code book. And they do two very different things, but paving streets and connectivity, especially to a downtown business area, was one of the main progressive aims and goals of the time, right? At-large systems are now often criticized by being really, really prioritizing downtown government, business-friendly policies. And at the time, this was just a part of that, right? Building streets so that wagons could get to town, building streets so that new automobiles could drive into the city. This was a big thing. The second thing is sanitation. So at this time, sewers were really new technology and they were being built, as well as like city dumps and abattoirs or slaughterhouses, cemeteries. So they were figuring out where to put these things, and that was the role of the sanitation department. And proof positive of this, between 1900 and 1940, communicable disease or death, let me see how to say this. I can't remember how they say it. I think it's like communicable disease mortality decreased by 75% in US cities. So this was a major effect, right? This idea of development and urbanizing was at the top of mind. And that's why they hired a city manager who could hire employees, fire employees, present a budget, run departments, things like that, outside of the city council agenda. So zoning, like I suspected, was a major policy lever of the progressive era, and the city council began to use it pretty immediately as the at-large council was elected. But it wasn't until 1928, when the new city plan was passed, that zoning became a major part of the city council agenda, and they were structuring things like neighborhood districts, industrial policy, commercial districts. So they were kind of building the city through policy, right? Organizing how they thought it should be, who should live where, what should go where. Again, this is known as like a major progressive era policy lever for governments. So cities across the country were doing this type of stuff in order to organize the city in the progressive sort of manifest idea. Quickly, I want to pause and talk about the city plan. Again, passed in 1928. It's now remembered only for segregating the city. So what used to be East Avenue is now I-35. It's being expanded yet again, so it's soon going to be like 12 lanes through downtown Austin. But East Avenue was the color line. So Latinos lived between the river and East 7th Avenue, and black folks lived between East 7th Avenue and what is now known as Manor. It's spelled Manor, it's pronounced Manor. I'm sorry, I don't know why. But, right, it was just east of East Avenue. The city said, if you would like to receive services like sewers, like sidewalks, like streets and schools, y'all all have to move east of East Avenue. At the time, of course, right, like, it's not like the city was like totally integrated and suddenly they like ripped everybody up. It was definitely neighborhood to neighborhood, pockets everywhere. Before Austin was even established in 1839, there were a lot of indigenous people that lived there, a lot of black folks too, a lot of previously enslaved people that had set up communities all around Austin. So those were like deeply entrenched communities with schools and churches and stores and things like that. A lot of the city's current infrastructure and some of the most important sites in Austin still bear the name of those places. The grocery store Wheatsville is named after Wheatville in the neighborhood that they established in. So things like that, like sort of blink and you'll miss it, references to this more integrated past at least, exist all over town. But the interesting thing about this city plan and why it's remembered so starkly is because race is only mentioned once. And race is only mentioned in terms of black folks. At the time, there are some like very antiquated names or groupings that they gave for Latinos. So something that is unfailing until about the 70s in the city council meetings I found is that any time a black person was in city council, whether it was to apply for like a taxi cab driver license or a sidewalk permit for out their house or anything, their race was noted. Latinos were not. So sometimes they would say Puerto Rican, sometimes they would say Spanish, sometimes they would say Latin. And political science has kind of clunky ways of capturing that, right? I thought maybe I should use last names. And then I remembered I myself am a Latina and my name is Brooke Nicole Shannon, so it's not going to be perfect. And so I thought I want to capture the most explicit motivating factor for this city plan and segregating the city, which was to segregate African Americans in the city. So the quote unquote race problem mentioned by the city planners that they hired from Koch and Fowler in Dallas, so we can go ahead and blame this on Dallas, I guess. They said, you know, it's really expensive, basically, to continually have these like small pockets of neighborhoods throughout the city, because when we want to build a white school, we need to build like a less good school for black kids. And so they said, we should really not be like rerouting sewers and electric lines. We should just make sure that people live across East Avenue and services will eventually come to them, right? So explicitly, they say, there has been considerable talk in Austin, as well as other cities, in regard to the race segregation problem. This problem cannot be solved legally under any zoning law known to us at present. Practically all attempts of such have been proven unconstitutional. And this is true, right? The Supreme Court case, I think of 1917 in Louisville, said that you cannot explicitly just segregate based on race. So they had to get kind of progressive about it. And they had to say, okay, we're not going to do it completely based on race. We're going to do it so that people can get services, right? So this was kind of that implicit but definitely motivated by race problems that these folks identify. So they do identify a specific district east of East Avenue and south of the city cemetery, which continues to be the seat, the heart of the black community in Austin. And they say, it is our recommendation that the nearest approach to the solution, ... will be the recommendation of this district as a Negro district, as an African American district, and that all facilities and conveniences be provided here, right? So they said Fine, the necessity of duplication will be eliminated if it's just in this area, because parks will be there, schools will be there, et cetera, et cetera. So, looking to race in Austin, for this subtopic specifically, there are a lot of items that are coded for just like race under the civil rights category. And the civil rights major topic includes both like pro and opposition policies, right? So anything that is about communities of color continually, right? Like the Cesar Chavez parade is listed under 201. But I also wanted to include every instance of like sewers, schools, zoning policies that were targeted at communities of color. So I did a bunch of searches. I stemmed all of the words here, and I did a bunch of like topics and searches for these words and included those as well in a binary dummy variable, and that's included in this category, in this variable. So we see, similar to the first diversity score, right, we see some outliers here, but the trend is down after 1928, and that is because of the implicit yet pretty strongly motivated policies put out in the city plan of 1928, which didn't have to say much, but they were very effective in segregating the city. I think of this as almost like an ideological thing, like it was sort of understood in city council, right, that this was going to happen and that this was the motivator of the policy, and that is why these two paragraphs are the only real place that they had to say, and this is our plan for African Americans in Austin. So I want to wrap up here with just some final conclusions, some final thoughts, that the Progressive Era reforms that structured the city government and the mechanisms that were put forth to do so, as well as like the land use policy specifically, had a pretty long-lasting effect, specifically on agenda setting processes in Austin. Because, once again, right, like when city council's agenda was more expanded and not held back, I guess, or the attention wasn't held up by these nominations and appointments to staff the bureaucracy, city council was enabled to make policy on more traditional local government things like land use. Zoning was the way that they did that, empowered by the city plan of 1928. And of course, they didn't have to say it, but race was ever present in these progressive reforms. And those are very lasting as well, that you can read about in the city agenda in just a year or two. So I just want to say thank you so much. This is my email if you have any questions or want to reach out. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Brooke. Question time. I think it's traditional that a student goes first. I don't know if that means graduate or undergraduate necessarily, but if a student wants to go first, and then we can get into faculty and anyone else. AV guys, jump on in. I might ask a question. Yeah. I'm going to bring this around awkwardly. Yeah.
Thank you so much for presenting. This was great. My question stems from kind of a current issue still going on within Texas. Municipal and school board elections within North Texas have become increasingly influenced by the funding of West Texas PACs, like Texas United for a Conservative Majority or the Defend Texas Liberty Pact. In the context of your presentation, it seems like the West Texas PACs of today mirror this kind of progressive movement into Texas. Do you think that the continuation of this municipal interference is systematically ingrained within the larger political structure of the state of Texas, or does it reflect a larger national systematic structure?
That's a great question, thanks. So one thing I would say is, while the West Texas PACs, specifically in school board elections, are larger than other places, this is a kind of nationalization issue, right, of national issues sort of trickling down into local policy where there's not very much jurisdiction. So school boards are separate, of course, from city councils, and in the city council, when local governments are making education policy, typically, especially back then, is where are schools going to be built and how are they going to be like staffed. So I will say, like, a limitation of these data are that I don't have the school board. I would love to look at that though, especially in the same progressive era. I know that there was, I can't remember what town it is, maybe Eads, right outside Austin, in like 2014, that was a school board election, that suddenly had an influx of like $25 million into the race, which is unheard of, right? There's like maybe 20,000 students in this whole district. So it was very weird, and it was immediately understood to be a nationalization issue. I do think, though, that most school boards around the country are elected. I'm not sure about West Texas. I would not be surprised if school boards in West Texas are appointed. And it's just because of that path dependence of local governance. And in such a like low populated area, right? The congressional district of West Texas, one of them spreads from El Paso to southern San Antonio, and it's just because there's way more cows than people for most of it. So I would suspect that those kind of old school systems really do endure in policymaking in every institution in West Texas. And I think that the strain of that is really evident in these type of issues, especially because there was such a salient news story in schools in West Texas in 2022 when Uvalde happened and the shooting there. And then like the sort of limitations and the constraints of the city, the county, and the school board were like very clear for everyone to see. And I suspect that that's why. Yeah, I suspect you're onto something there.
Thanks. This is. Hello?
Is it good? I should tell everyone, you're going to talk into this thing, you're not going to hear anything.
Ah, okay.
That's because it's for the like streaming. So just, yeah.
So, okay, duly noted. Thanks so much for this presentation. This was a very fascinating. I'm interested in a sense of more of, I guess, like the overarching theories, like what is the theory of political change here? And so, like, I'm interested, what is progressive era reform? Like, obviously, this is a big question, but who are the local players on the ground? What are the interest groups? What are the different aspects at play? I'll leave it there. What is the theory of political change and influence that constitutes progressive era reform?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So definitely the theory of political change here and the data that I present is absolutely city council, right? It's very institutional. But what I'm working on now is collecting data from the newspapers of the time. So that I think will get to your question a little more. I have already collected and analyzed the data that's available on the Austin Public Library website, which includes the current newspaper, the main one, Austin American Statesman, and the older issues of the American and the Statesman, right? So they blended, they merged. But in January, I'll be going back to the city and state archives to collect the smaller, like affinity group newspapers and newsletters that are housed in the city and state libraries in order to get at that theory of change, because there are interest groups. Adrian Liazos from Harvard wrote a really cool book on the National Municipal League, which is like this national interest group that was all about at-large councils and city managers and like reforming the cities all over the country. They started in New York where they were less successful. And so they began to like west of the Mississippi. So I do take your point for sure that this is all very much like institutional and there was a movement outside pushing it. And so I'm hoping to get at that with the local news, talking about both change and the players in city council, like locally, as well as this kind of comparative aspect of it all, pointing out cities like Chicago and St. Louis and Houston that had these like very loud commissions and political machines, and almost as like a warning, sort of working lockstep and in the same literal like beer halls and restaurants with the city councilors, right? So yeah, I think that's just because I haven't collected all the data yet, but that was a great question. Oh, thanks.
I'm going to exercise host's prerogative here and ask a question to my friend and comrade. Can you say anything about what you know or suspect the presence of partisanship was in this?
Yeah.
I'm assuming ignorantly, I don't actually know anything about this, but the old model of state of courts and parties was probably a democratic machine of some kind in Austin, maybe not. How did the progressives interact with that? What was the sort of long-term, short-term legacy of that? And it's the South, it's Texas, I assume democratic, but maybe not.
Absolutely. So it is a single-party system at the time. And the national movement for the progressive era was for sure targeted at these urban machines, in part because they are so closely related and controlled by the national parties. One of my favorite pieces on this is by John Rogowski, and he uses post offices and postal boxes in cities and where they are in location, like to the different wards and districts, to measure the tight proximity between local machines and political parties. I don't have that kind of data, but it's like a dream project for sure, because at the time they were very tightly controlled by the parties for sure. So like nonpartisan elections, this was all part of the like getting this sort of political machine, like you scratch my back, I scratch your back, like I'm Irish, therefore all of my friends who are Irish are gonna become cops and postal workers and things like that. Like this was all party related, you know? So yes, it was a single party system for sure. Like the lily white primaries were existent through Texas, another civil rights case. And so it was kind of animated by party, but not really since it was the South, you know? But it was to get just like the money, the corruption, the policy out of local government, to run it like a business.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you want to go? Or was that your question?
No, that was not my question. It was better than my question. Now I'm struggling. If Professor Zug is going to take the prerogative of the host to ask a question, I'm going to take the prerogative of someone who's been here forever to make a comment, ask a serious question, and then ask a fun question.
Fabulous.
The comment is that even though your theory is centered on city councils, it seems like everything's following from electoral system change, right? As soon as you change the electoral system, and as an electoral systems institutions guy, we'll just state that electoral systems drive everything of importance downstream.
Yes.
The question I have is when you change the rules of the election mechanism to the system, that large system, as sort of a Nelson Polsby question. Do you see the development of institutional capacity within the city council? Do you see increasing staff? Do you start to see longevity in term? Because now they have to deal with a more professionalized bureaucracy. And the one thing we know about, say, Congress or something like that is to deal with professionalized bureaucracy, the legislators had to professionalize as well. They had to create their own staff. That's the more political sciencey question. The question I'd like you to speculate on is the at-large system developed a very bizarre set of norms in Austin.
Yes.
As you're probably aware, that we had an at-large, the city had an at-large system,
Yes.
but numbered seats were quote-unquote reserved
Yes.
this is completely outside the legal system, reserved for African Americans or reserved for Hispanics, and that system lasted into 2012.
Yep.
And how do you have any idea how these norms developed?
Yes.
And things like that, there you go. Those are my comment, question, and question.
Yeah, those were all great. Thank you. Yeah, all of them are fun
they're
for
all
me
fun.
personally, but it's because I'm obsessed with this stuff. So thank you for those questions. The first one, yes, and it just happens 11 years after this piece ends. So in 1951, Arthur DeWitty came in 6th place. So that means he almost won a seat on city council. Arthur DeWitty was the head of the local NAACP chapter, and he was an elder in the Ebenezer Baptist Church. So you've ascertained that Arthur DeWitty was a black man at this point. So that scared so much the political machine of the era that it was present in these newspapers, it was present in these newsletters. They were like, we need a seat system immediately. So this election was April 1951. By January 1st, 1953, they had established a place system for the at-large council. So this gentleman's agreement this is what it's officially called, came around that time where they said, we're gonna ensure with these places that no community of color, still at this point, African Americans have never been over like 11 or 12% of the local population. Latinos are typically about 30 to 40. So they said, we want to ensure that none of them can get a seat in city council by putting our support behind people, right? It's really expensive to run a whole city race. And so because Arthur DeWitty was like a present citizen in city council, like always in the agendas, asking for like services and things for the Black community, they knew he had a lot of support, but he did not have support of the white, like middle class majority. So they instituted in 1971 a gentleman's agreement because they were like, oh no, the Voting Rights Act passed. We can no longer have poll taxes and suppress everyone. So the gentleman's agreement ensured that one seat would be held for an African American member and a Latino member. 1971, Burl Hancock is elected, who is a Black man. 1975, Johnny Trevino is elected, who is Latino. And so that was seat 2 and seat 6, what would become seat 6 when they expanded council. It wasn't until the districted council was elected and inaugurated in January 2015 that a Black person and a Latino didn't hold that one specific seat for their community. So along with the system of at-large, the like racial order in Austin lasted a very, very long time. And there were about 6 failed votes beginning in the 70s also to institute some kind of district map, regardless of whether it was hybrid or to change the electoral structure completely, but it continuously failed until 2012 when they decided we're gonna do something about it. But right, this kind of reform jostles things up a lot. So yes, to the question of this like backroom gentleman's agreement. Unfortunately for me, there's nothing that they said officially in the minutes, which I wish they did. But they just sort of implicitly, similar to the city plan, said this is gonna be like your seat. It's definitely important to know that even when they instituted it, before they expanded the council to 6, that was always gonna be a minority, and it was designed that way. So held remarkably long time for sure. Broke kind of under the pressure of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement. That definitely had a lot of implications in Austin. And yeah, the big research question of, I would say one of them in the big city agenda project is how do these institutional reforms, how much does the theory of change hold, right? That like electoral reform, changing the structure will change the agenda. Does that mean that underrepresented groups and groups who are systematically kept out of the policy agenda will suddenly appear? And the answer that I found is yes and no. So I have a piece from Urban Affairs Review where I categorized all of these different policies on the agenda, and I asked whether or not once districts come in, what kind of emergent issues appear? Like, does the city suddenly have a lot of renter policies or, fixing old infrastructure? Because when the infrastructure did come to the east side, it was like piecemeal. I lived on the east side for 6 years, and I had to jog in the cemetery because there were no sidewalks, and it was the safest place to be, So there's a lot of like catch up, but I do find also that the constraints of local government, which some come down from national and state levels, but some are just like the old misattributed quote of Mayor LaGuardia is that there's no Republican or Democrat way to pick up the garbage. So the agenda's full with sanitation and the like pragmatic policy of cities, but there is a precipitous shift in the 1 to 2 years after districts are brought in, and then it sort of goes back to the old way. I think because of that, there's so many problems facing every city that it's just difficult to make a coalition out of these district systems. So.
More central to your project, do you see, as they move to the at-large system, the increase in staff and professionalization affiliated with council members, as opposed to the departments, that they create their own professional staff to effectively interact with the newly professionalized departments?
Yeah, so that's something that I haven't included, but I do have access because of the budget that includes the personnel, right? So I would be able to access that for sure. I do have an expanded like chapter version of the nomination appointments. I do have like the number of civil servants just writ large, and also in the budget as it becomes more professionalized. Every department shows like the number of employees that they have, so I would be able to do that. I'm not sure if I can look at per district the city like policy employees and bureaucrats, but I know most of the counselors from bugging them for like 10 years that I think I'd be able to get those. So that's a really great point. Yeah, thank you.
Other questions? Yeah, Matt.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. I was just going to ask, maybe this is too meta or ethereal, but like, you know, I'm a political theorist, so that's what I do.
Awesome.
So I was wondering about the choice, and maybe there's some pragmatic reasons and also some theoretical ones, but just like using city agendas as like your primary source of data, like the things that cities produce, like what is it, how does that shape your story? Like what are the things that you think its limits? What are the things that you really think you get at that other ways of talking about a city, how it produces the state, how it reproduces these things? What do you get that you wouldn't get from other sorts of, like from newspapers or from other sorts of accounts? Like what are the analytic advantages you have from using the agenda as opposed to some other things cities produce?
So something that's cool in terms of using the agenda is that I can see a primary source of just like what they're talking about and how they talk about it. That you miss from newspaper articles that are obviously from a different perspective and that will like shape salience and interest. But I think that I really like to think about this and how just the attention breaks down over these major topics. So I think the purchase of studying an agenda is really interesting, and I am a student of Brian Jones who does agenda setting, so I'm sorry if I sound very Jonesian. I am in the cult of Jones though. So the idea is that at the agenda level, risk and cost are way lower than looking at like an output or a public law, because at the national level, there's not really a local equivalent to this, but you know, it's got to go through committees and it's got to be voted on by both houses and both chambers. At the local level, pretty much somebody has to get it onto the agenda, and then the city council is like it. Now in the complicated modern era, it's like if you want to do housing stuff, you got to go through the planning commission. But at the same time, right, the city council agenda is an interesting place to see how and where like underrepresented groups issues do emerge. And this idea of like the second face of power, right? What we're talking about with the gentleman's agreement, the real power in agenda setting is the stuff you don't let on the agenda, but you can't measure it. So that's difficult for a political scientist. But that is the main reason I like the agenda. More modern studies, like large N studies looking at a lot of cities around the country, focus on things like state of the city addresses from mayors. And they do similar coding schemes even to this to see like the priorities of the executive locally. But this I think is an interesting way to kind of get at that like top of the funnel, which is again like lower risk, lower cost for a city councilor or a mayor to introduce an ordinance, may or may not pass, but getting at all of that minutia, like I just think it's a really rich way to look at the whole spread of what goes into a city. Yeah.
Really interesting. We could probably do one more question. Is there one over here? Yeah, Emily, please. Look at the heavy hitters in here.
I actually wanted to finish with a kind of broad question, maybe just an invitation to speculate also. But I was thinking about bringing your account into conversation with Suzanne Mettler's work in Dividing Citizens. And I don't know if that's out of left field because I know it's a little bit of a different time frame. But as I understand Mettler's argument, she's suggesting that New Deal era policies that are administered at the national level are kind of egalitarian compared to those that are administered at the state and local levels, which are more racialized and gendered. And so I'm interested in bringing your account into conversation with that because it does seem like you might be pushing back on some of those precepts in terms terms of thinking that we're getting this progressive era racism telescoped from the national level down to the local levels. But we could also see, of course, this as an example of local policy. So
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question, and that's such a good book. I'm a huge Mettler fan. So in this book, really focusing on like New Deal top-down implementation, I know that for me, looking at a single city and how like the local agenda changes with these different focusing events, I was more interested, in like this sort of like network throughout the policy or the progressive era, in that there was this national movement, but it wasn't really top down, and it was very much like city to city. So in terms of like, of course, like suffrage and prohibition, that's obviously national policy, but that's not really talked about at all in the agenda. They are talking about these ideas of like, we don't want to be like Chicago and New York where immigrants run the place. Like, we gotta put the hammer down and really work on reforming our city and make it a place that's safe to do business and that people want to come do business in. So that's something definitely to think about more because of the egalitarian nation of the New Deal and its like long-term implications, especially at the local level with employment, unions, and like redistribution of resources. That's something that I haven't really grappled with, but it is a really interesting research question, especially for even like a future chapter that looks more at national implementation. So thanks for that. Sorry I don't have a really good answer for it, but.
Okay. That was awesome. Thank you so much, Brooke. And all of you for your excellent questions and attendance. Please give it up for Brooke Shannon.
Thank you.
Okay, I have to do a few announcements. Okay. I'm sorry. And I have one additional announcement. No, I had a piece of paper. Oh, wait, we're good. You can tell I don't have Jay's practice doing this. Okay, so our next event, Kinder event, is, I'm just going to read what Karen sent me so I don't get it wrong. She sent me specific language. So our next event is set for Homecoming, where our very own Dr. Jeff Pasley is, I guess he's here somewhere, Kinder Institute Chair in Early American History, will preview his new book project, an epic nonfiction Western that tells the saga of Kansas abolitionist Dr. John Doy and the motley team that rescued him from Missouri captivity in 1959. So who's not going to come to that? Oh yeah, 1850s. Karen wrote this. Second, to any undergraduates joining us today, I know there's lots of you out there, applications are due on October 13th, just over a week from now, for the Kinder Scholars DC program. If you're thinking about applying, please talk with one of us. Don't talk to me. I don't know anything about that. Applications are also due November 1st for our new Kinder RAI Summer Oxford Summer School. And then a third and final announcement that I just got right now. I'm going to try to do my best. Do you want to just come in and say it?
Hi, everybody. Most of y'all know my name is Sean Hall and at Black Studies. I just wanted to announce that next week on the 10th and 11th in the Smith Forum Room and Reynolds Journalism Institute, we'll be having the Black Studies Fall Conference 2024. Several of you will get an email with the itinerary, but hopefully everybody will come. The topic is the critical issues on college campuses. We're going to have students that were part of the 2015 protests coming, and they will be speaking on Friday. So please come by. We'll have breakfast and lunch so everybody can get fed and be energized, participate, ask questions, and just enjoy.
Thank you so much, and thank you all of you. We've got Pursuit of Happiness Hour out there. Have fun. That was awesome. That was so good.